Retired veteran turns down award until he learns who it's from. Henry Collins lived in a small, modest house on the edge of a sleepy suburban town, a place where the streets were lined with maple trees and quiet seemed to blanket everything. The house had a worn yet welcoming charm, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and a slanted roof that had seen better days, but still held strong. The air in the neighborhood was fresh and crisp, the kind of place where nothing much ever seemed to change. People waved to each other on their daily walks, dogs barked in the distance, and the hum of lawnmowers filled the Saturday mornings. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, a sanctuary, as Henry had come to think of it. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. For the past 10 years, ever since he'd retired from the army, Henry had found peace in the quiet rhythms of suburban life. Each day began with a cup of black coffee on his porch, where he would sit in a weathered wooden rocking chair, the creak of its motion as familiar to him as the beating of his own heart. He had long since traded the urgency of military life for the simplicity of watching the sun rise over the neighborhood, the orange and pink hues reflecting off the windows of the homes around him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The mornings were always solitary. Henry liked it that way. He would sit in the same chair, sipping his coffee and watching the world wake up. Sometimes he would notice the young couple next door, their toddler running around in the front yard, laughing as they chased after him. At other times, he'd see a neighbor out walking their dog, the soft sound of their feet tapping on the concrete sidewalks. The neighborhood was peaceful, safe, and easy, exactly what Henry had hoped for when he left the chaos of the army behind. Despite the serenity, there was always a sense of distance between Henry and the rest of the world. It wasn't that he was unfriendly or that he disliked the people around him. Quite the opposite. He greeted his neighbors with a polite smile and exchanged pleasantries when they crossed paths. But there was always a certain barrier, a wall that seemed to rise between him and the rest of the world. The small talk, the casual chit-chat, it all felt foreign to him. After years of being trained to be alert, focused, and quick in his responses, the mundanity of civilian life sometimes felt like a strange and uncomfortable puzzle. The truth was, Henry was still getting used to being just another person in the world, not someone on the front lines, not someone with a purpose defined by duty. The army had defined him for nearly 4 decades. It had shaped him, molded him into a man who had learned to be tough, unyielding, and most of all, stoic. It had taught him how to survive in the harshest conditions, how to hold his ground when everything seemed to be falling apart. But when he retired, when the uniform came off for the last time, Henry found himself standing at a precipice, unsure of who he was without it. He'd spent years in war zones, Afghanistan, Iraq, and a handful of other places that didn't show up on tourist maps. He had led men into battle, carried the weight of their lives on his shoulders, and made decisions that no one should ever have to make. He'd watched friends fall, sometimes in slow motion, sometimes in a single instant. The army had taken so much from him, his youth, his innocence, his trust in the world. But it had also given him a sense of purpose, a clear understanding of who he was and what he was meant to do. Now, in his quiet home, the lack of clarity was overwhelming. There were no orders to follow, no missions to accomplish, no comrades to look out for. It was just him, Henry Collins, a retired veteran with no real direction. The sense of purpose that had once been so sharp and defined had dulled with time, replaced by the soft hum of a world that didn't need him anymore. The local veterans community did its best to reach out to him. They invited him to gatherings, to barbecues, to meetings where old soldiers could reminisce about their glory days and share stories of their time in the service. But Henry avoided them, mostly out of habit. He wasn't interested in reliving those days, even if the men around him had made it seem like the only thing worth talking about. The camaraderie that had once felt so vital in the heat of battle now felt like a burden. The stories, the jokes, the laughter reminded him of all the things he had lost. It wasn't that he didn't care about his brothers in arms. He did deeply. But there was something about the way they held on to the past that unsettled him. The hardest part, though, wasn't the isolation. It was the way people looked at him when they found out he was a veteran. It wasn't the curiosity or the respect. It was something else. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was pity, or maybe it was a sense of awe that felt misplaced. People treated him as if he were a relic, a remnant of a past they didn't understand, and he didn't know how to respond to that. When they thanked him for his service, it felt hollow. He didn't feel like a hero, and he certainly didn't want to be treated like one. Heroes, to him, were the ones who never came home, the ones whose names were carved into memorials, whose faces were never seen again. His life outside of the military had become an exercise in avoidance. Henry kept his head down. He avoided the post office parties, the town hall events, and the neighborhood gatherings where everyone seemed to be so keen on finding ways to celebrate life's milestones. He wasn't interested in any of it. His home, the one he'd chosen after his retirement, became both his sanctuary and his prison. It was quiet, isolated, and free from the expectations of others. But even in his solitude, there were moments when Henry found himself wrestling with an uncomfortable truth. He might have been free from the army, but he wasn't free from the weight of it. The memories had a way of creeping in when he least expected it. The faces of the men he'd served with. The faces of those who didn't make it back. The faces of civilians caught in the crossfire, their lives shattered in an instant. The memory of blood, of explosions, of cries for help that he couldn't always answer. It was a different kind of loneliness, the kind that haunted the quiet moments, the spaces between his breaths. No amount of coffee, no amount of time in front of the TV could erase the image of what he had seen, of what he had done. At times, Henry thought he might be going mad. But it wasn't madness. It was just the slow, inevitable erosion of a man's spirit, a man who had spent too long in a world where survival was the only thing that mattered. And when survival became second nature, when it no longer felt like a choice, it was hard to shake the belief that the rest of life, peaceful, ordinary life, was just a temporary illusion. But there was something that kept him going, something that kept him rooted in his daily routines. It wasn't the quiet, not exactly. It wasn't the stillness. It was a deeper, more profound connection to the world he had left behind, even if he didn't fully understand it. There was a strange comfort in the monotony of life, in the predictability of his days. The sun rose. The sun set. The seasons changed.
He could count on that.
Maybe, just maybe, it was the only thing left that made sense. There were moments, fleeting ones, when Henry thought of the past in ways that weren't tinged with pain. He remembered the sound of boots marching in unison, the discipline that had been drilled into him, the sense of belonging that came from being part of something bigger than himself. Those memories were bittersweet. They reminded him of who he had been and of who he no longer was. And yet, in the back of his mind, he knew there was something more. He hadn't been content with just surviving. He hadn't been content with the quiet life he had carved out for himself. There were days when he longed for a purpose again, when the silence of his house became too much, when the absence of battle, of conflict, seemed foreign and unsettling. Those moments never lasted long, but they reminded him that he wasn't as at peace with his past as he liked to think. The medals, the honors, the memories, none of them could fill the void he'd left behind when he walked away from it all. For now, though, he was content to sit in his rocking chair, sip his coffee, and keep the world at arm's length. It was a life he had chosen, a life of peace, but even peace could feel like a battle. And Henry Collins had long since learned that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones you fought within yourself. The morning Henry Collins received the letter began as any other, peaceful and routine. The first light of day filtered through the cracks in the blinds, casting soft shadows on the hardwood floors of his living room. His house, a modest but comfortable space, still smelled faintly of the fresh pinewood scent that had been the hallmark of its old beams. It had been his home for over a decade now, a place that had absorbed his moods, his joys, and his sorrows. He'd lived in this house long enough to know that the moments of tranquility he so often sought would never last forever. But for now, it was quiet, and that was all he needed. Henry had just finished his morning coffee and was standing by the window, watching the leaves of the oak tree outside dance in the cool breeze, when the mail carrier's car pulled up in front of his house. The carrier, a young man named Chris, waved as he placed the usual assortment of letters and flyers in Henry's mailbox. The sun had only just risen, and the neighborhood was still hushed, the air thick with the promise of another slow day. Henry shuffled out to the mailbox, his slippers dragging lightly on the pavement, and sorted through the pile. Bills, advertisements, a catalog for gardening tools, nothing out of the ordinary. But then he found it, a thick, official-looking envelope, its weight unexpected in his hands. The return address was familiar, though he hadn't seen it in years. It was from Captain William Maxwell, his former commanding officer from his time in the military. A lump formed in Henry's throat as his fingers brushed over the paper. Captain Maxwell, the man who had led him through some of the toughest battles in his life, the man whose orders had often meant the difference between life and death. Henry had not heard from him in nearly 2 decades. Their last correspondence had been short and to the point, a final acknowledgement of their service and a quiet, unspoken understanding that they would both move on from the war. That was the way things worked when men like them served. When the dust settled, they simply walked away, often without fanfare. But there was something about that letter, something about the weight of it, that made Henry uneasy. He turned it over in his hands before slowly tearing it open, the silence of the moment seeming to echo in his empty house. Inside was a neatly folded letter on heavy stationery, the kind used for official correspondence. The words that followed struck Henry like a physical blow. Dear Mr. Collins, I hope this letter finds you well. It has been many years since our last contact, and I trust that life has been treating you with the respect and peace you so deserve after all you have given in service to this country. It is my great honor, on behalf of the Veterans Association, to inform you that you have been selected to receive the Silver Star of Honor for your extraordinary bravery during the Operation Phoenix mission in 2004. Your actions that day saved countless lives, and your leadership under fire is something that we still talk about to this day. We would be grateful if you could join us for the award ceremony, which will take place in Washington, D.C. on November 15, 2024, at the National Veterans Hall. Your presence at the ceremony would be a great honor to both us and your fellow veterans. Please let us know if you're able to attend. With deepest respect, Captain William Maxwell, Commanding Officer, Ret. Henry stood frozen in the kitchen, the letter in his hands trembling. The words blurred before his eyes, the ink fading as the weight of the invitation settled heavily on his chest. A silver star, the very same medal that had been awarded to soldiers for acts of heroism in the face of extreme danger. He could hardly breathe. His body felt cold, even though the sun streamed through the windows. It had been over 20 years since the mission in question. Operation Phoenix. The name alone sent a shiver down Henry's spine. He'd been the one to call in the airstrike that had saved his team, but it had come at a terrible cost. The memory of that day was still etched in his mind, clearer than anything that had come after it. The blinding flash of the explosion, the deafening roar of the aircraft above, and the chaotic scramble for cover. And then, the aftermath. The bodies, the devastation, and the haunting silence that followed. The men he had led through that hellish day, some of them still bore the scars of it, both physically and mentally. Henry had always struggled with the idea of being recognized for something like that. He didn't feel like a hero. Heroes were the ones who didn't come home. Heroes were the ones who didn't walk away from the wreckage, haunted by the faces of their fallen comrades. What had he done, really? He had made the call. He had followed orders. He had kept his team alive. But at what cost? His hand tightened around the letter as the memories began to flood back. He'd been young then, full of idealism and a deep sense of duty. Back then, he thought about the military as a machine, something powerful, unyielding, and righteous. He had believed in the cause, had believed that everything he did was for a higher purpose. But over the years, those beliefs had eroded, chipped away by the years of combat, the unspoken trauma of losing friends, and the questions that had no answers. He closed his eyes, trying to push the memories back into the recesses of his mind, but it was impossible. The images were too vivid, too alive, even now. He could still see the faces of the men who had fought beside him, the ones who had died in the firefight. Their names haunted him: Corporal Jake McKinney, Sergeant Antonio Reyes, and Lieutenant Sarah Fields. Their faces flashed before his eyes as he thought about what had been lost that day. They would never get to hold a silver star. They would never be honored for their bravery, their sacrifices. And here he was, standing on the precipice of receiving this medal, a symbol that, to him, felt more like a cruel joke than an honor. He sat down at the kitchen table, the letter still clenched in his hands. The room felt small, suffocating even, as his mind raced. He had long ago distanced himself from the military. He had built a life outside of it, tried to find peace in the quiet of his home, in the solitude that gave him distance from the chaos of his past. Now, this letter had reopened a door he had worked so hard to keep shut. Henry had declined honors and awards before. Each time, the process was the same. He would politely refuse, thank them for their consideration, and continue on with his life. He never wanted to be celebrated. The medals and the accolades weren't what mattered to him. What mattered was the memory of his friends, his fallen comrades, who had never had the chance to go home, to live a quiet life like he had. But something about this invitation felt different. It wasn't just the silver star itself. It was the timing, the very fact that it had come now, so many years after the fact. There was a part of him that wondered if the world was trying to tell him something. Perhaps this was a chance for closure, for reconciliation with the past. Maybe he needed to go to that ceremony, to accept the honor, even if it made him uncomfortable. Maybe it would be the moment that allowed him to finally lay down his burdens. Yet, the thought of standing before a crowd, receiving that medal, and having to relive the trauma of that day made him feel sick. He didn't want the attention. He didn't want the recognition. What he wanted was peace, and no medal, no ceremony, could give him that. He stared at the letter again, reading the words over and over, as if hoping they might somehow change, might offer him a different kind of clarity. But they didn't. The invitation was clear. The award was his, and the ceremony was waiting. All he had to do was show up. The weight of the decision pressed on him like a physical force. He stood up, pacing the kitchen, his mind whirling in circles. Should he go? Should he decline, as he always had? Or was this the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would finally allow him to put the past to rest? Henry set the letter down and walked out to his front porch, the cool air brushing against his face as he sat in the same old rocking chair where he had spent so many quiet mornings. He closed his eyes and let the stillness wash over him. The world around him was calm, the neighborhood undisturbed. But inside, he was anything but calm. The invitation had torn open old wounds he had thought were healing. His hand instinctively reached for the pocket of his flannel shirt, where the small silver cross he wore around his neck rested. It was a simple, unadorned piece of jewelry, something his mother had given him before he deployed for the first time, a token of protection, of faith. He had worn it through every mission, through every war zone. It was a reminder that, no matter what happened, there was always something greater than the chaos surrounding him. As his fingers closed around the cool metal, Henry made a silent promise to himself. He would not let the ghosts of his past define him. But whether he would accept the award or refuse it, he didn't know. All he knew was that the decision loomed, and the weight of it felt heavier than any battle he had ever fought. After days of sleepless nights and restless days, Henry finally made the decision. He would go. He couldn't explain it, not in a way that made any sense, but something deep inside him had urged him to accept the invitation to the Silver Star ceremony in Washington, D.C. Maybe it was guilt. Guilt for the men who hadn't made it home. Guilt for having survived when so many others hadn't. Or perhaps it was something more, a longing for resolution, an unconscious hope that somehow, attending the ceremony might bring him the closure he had been searching for all these years. Whatever the reason, Henry knew that he had to go. The decision, however, was only the beginning of his struggles. The path forward was uncertain, foreign, and fraught with complications. The man who had spent years in uniform, who had been trained to face any situation with strategic clarity and unshakable resolve, now found himself in uncharted territory. This was no battlefield. This was a world that was unfamiliar to him, A world where smiles were as routine as handshakes, where small talk was expected, and everyone seemed to know exactly how to navigate the shallow waters of social interaction. He had never been good at that. In the army, conversations were direct. Orders were clear. There was no room for ambiguity or confusion. But civilian life had taught him that the lines were never as clear as they seemed. For the first time in over a decade, Henry felt like a stranger in his own skin. Every step of the way to Washington was a reminder of how disconnected he had become from the world around him. As the day of the ceremony drew nearer, the quiet comfort of his suburban home seemed like a distant memory, one he could no longer fully appreciate. The thought of stepping into the bright, bustling streets of Washington, D.C., a city filled with unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar customs, and unfamiliar expectations, filled him with dread. The morning of his flight, Henry stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, staring at his reflection. The suit he had bought for the occasion hung awkwardly on his frame. It was a dark navy, something simple, but still more formal than anything he had worn in years. His reflection seemed foreign to him. He didn't look like the man who had survived firefights, who had led men through chaos. That man was long gone, replaced by someone who seemed unsure of how to exist in this new life, in this new world. He tugged at his collar, feeling it pinch his neck, and let out a sigh. It wasn't just the suit. It was everything, the people, the expectations, the ceremony itself. The idea of standing in front of an audience, being honored for something he didn't feel he deserved, made him want to walk away. He had been alone for so long, his only company the ghosts of his past. He didn't know how to interact with people anymore, how to walk among them without feeling out of place. The flight to D.C. was uneventful, a blur of white noise and sterile air. Henry tried to sleep, but found it impossible. The cabin was too cramped, the hum of the engines too loud, the space too small. He stared out of the window at the clouds beneath him, trying to lose himself in the vastness of the sky, but it wasn't working. The reality of what he was about to do, what he had already committed to, loomed over him like an insurmountable obstacle. He wasn't just traveling to a different city. He was stepping into a life he didn't fully understand anymore, a life that seemed to belong to someone else. When the plane finally touched down at Dulles International Airport, Henry felt like he was waking up from a long, disorienting dream. The city sprawled before him in every direction, a dizzying maze of glass and steel, each building taller and more imposing than the last. He had seen cities before, had fought in them, had navigated their chaos, but this felt different. This was civilian life at its most vibrant, its most alive. It wasn't a place of strategy, of mission objectives. It wasn't a place where survival was the primary concern. This was a world where people moved in harmony, where the rules were subtle and unspoken. And Henry didn't know how to play by those rules. He had arranged for a hotel in the heart of D.C., not far from the National Veterans Hall where the ceremony would take place. The hotel was a mid-range establishment, nothing extravagant, but comfortable enough for a few nights. As he stepped into the lobby, the cool air of the hotel's air conditioning hit him, and he immediately felt out of place. The lobby was elegant, with polished marble floors and soft lighting that made everything look bright and welcoming. People moved about in groups, talking and laughing, some in business attire, others dressed casually. It was a sharp contrast to the sterile and utilitarian environments he had grown used to during his years in the military. Henry made his way to the front desk, his boots echoing against the marble. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, greeted him as though she were expecting him to be there. She asked for his name, handed him his room key, and mentioned the various amenities the hotel offered. Henry nodded politely, offering only brief responses. The pleasantries felt distant, like a language he had never fully learned. He reached his room and sat down on the bed, staring at the plain, white walls. It was hard to shake the feeling that he was waiting for something to happen, something that would help him understand what he was doing here. The invitation had come like a thunderclap out of nowhere. Now, standing in the middle of the city, he felt the weight of it all pressing on him. The ceremony was still a day away, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. The thought of walking into that hall, of accepting a medal for something he didn't feel he deserved, made his stomach churn. That evening, Henry took a walk around the city to clear his mind. The streets of Washington, D.C. were bustling with life, a stark contrast to the quiet streets of his hometown. There were families, tourists, students, and professionals, all moving with a sense of purpose, none of them giving him a second glance. Henry was just another face in the crowd. No one knew his story. No one understood the weight that pressed down on him. He wondered how many of them had their own battles to fight, their own ghosts to chase away. The thought of blending in with the crowd felt strange. He had spent so long standing apart from the world, keeping his distance from others, that now, the idea of being a part of it felt almost suffocating. As he wandered, his feet taking him through the National Mall, he found himself standing in front of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The black granite walls stretched before him, etched with the names of the fallen, their names carved into the stone for eternity. Henry didn't know why he had come here, but something drew him to it, something he couldn't explain. He placed his hand on the cold stone, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingers. For a long time, he stood there in silence, staring at the names, wondering how many of them had died in the same way his comrades had, fighting for a cause they could no longer remember, in a war that seemed like a distant memory. The memorial was a place of reflection, of mourning, but also of connection. Henry knew that he was not alone in his pain, that there were others who carried the same weight of loss, the same scars. He had never been able to share his burden with anyone. There had always been a part of him that refused to let anyone see the cracks in his armor. But standing there, surrounded by the names of the fallen, something inside him shifted. Maybe this ceremony, this medal, wasn't just about him. Maybe it was about them. The ones who had sacrificed everything, the ones who had never come home. That night, Henry lay in his hotel bed, staring at the ceiling. The noise of the city drifted in from outside, the sounds of life continuing on without him. He had always been an outsider in his own world, but here, in the heart of the nation's capital, he felt more like an observer than ever. The award, the ceremony, none of it made sense, not really. But in that moment, Henry knew that he had come here for a reason. He wasn't sure what that reason was, not yet, but he was about to find out. And in some small way, that was enough. The morning of the ceremony arrived too quickly for Henry's liking. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning in the unfamiliar hotel room. His mind had been in constant motion, a swirl of questions and doubts that kept him awake long after the bustling city outside had gone quiet. The weight of the decision to attend the ceremony, to accept an award that felt so undeserved, sat heavily on his chest. It was not the medal itself that troubled him. It was the attention, the validation, the recognition for something he still didn't know how to process. As Henry stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his suit, he was acutely aware of how out of place he felt. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, this kind of formal gathering. The last time he had worn something this formal was when he was a young officer attending briefings and official military events. That man, that younger version of himself, felt like a different person altogether. He hadn't worn a suit in years, not since he left the service, and now, standing in front of the mirror, the man looking back at him seemed unfamiliar, detached. His hand brushed against the collar of the shirt, the stiffness of it a reminder that this world, this civilian world, was one he had never quite fit into. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to push the anxiety aside. He had been trained for worse situations. He had stood in the heat of battle, with bullets whizzing past and the scent of smoke in the air, and had kept his cool. Why, then, was he so anxious now, standing in the relative safety of his hotel room, ready to attend a ceremony where the most dangerous thing he would face was a room full of strangers? It didn't make sense. Yet, the anxiety clung to him, gnawing at his insides. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at noon, and the hall was just a short walk from his hotel. He had received a map with his invitation, showing the directions to the National Veterans Hall. Henry had studied it the night before, trying to familiarize himself with the area. The map was simple enough, but still, the thought of navigating through an unfamiliar city, of walking into a room full of people who all seemed to know each other, made him uneasy. This wasn't the battlefield he had grown accustomed to. This was something altogether different. As he stepped out of his hotel room and into the hallway, he was immediately met with a rush of nervous energy. The hotel had been buzzing with activity all morning, with other veterans and their families arriving for the same event. He could hear laughter and chatter spilling out of rooms, the sound of footsteps hurrying to and from the elevators. For a moment, he considered turning back. He could leave. He could just pack his bags and disappear back into the life he had built in the quiet of his home. No one would know the difference. But then, the thought of those men, the ones who hadn't made it home, flashed through his mind. The faces of his fallen comrades, the ones whose names had been etched into his memory and whose deaths still haunted his every waking moment. He couldn't run away from this. He couldn't keep hiding from what had happened, what he had survived. Not anymore. With a deep, steadying breath, Henry made his way downstairs. The lobby was filled with people, veterans and their families, some younger, some older, all dressed in a similar mix of military and civilian attire. The uniforms were varied, ranging from polished dress whites to faded camouflage fatigues. The diversity of the crowd, in terms of age, experience, and appearance, only made Henry feel more out of place. He stood by the door for a moment, hesitating. No one seemed to notice him, and for a brief second, he felt like he could slip out unnoticed, just walk away and forget this whole ceremony. But then he saw it, the small cluster of men near the front, veterans who had gathered together, each holding their own stories, their own scars. One of them, an older man with gray hair and a weathered face, noticed Henry standing by the door. He walked over, a small smile on his lips. "Are you here for the ceremony, son?" the man asked, his voice warm but gruff. Henry nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Yes," he said, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. The man smiled more broadly, and Henry felt an odd sense of relief. The man's demeanor was gentle, inviting, and somehow familiar, like a relic from a past Henry hadn't realized he missed. He extended a hand, and Henry hesitated for just a moment before shaking it. "I'm George," the man said. "You've served, right?" Henry nodded again, not trusting himself to speak. George seemed to understand. "Well, you've come to the right place," George continued, his tone softening. "I know it can be a little overwhelming, but we've all been there. Just take it one step at a time." The simple words, though nothing profound, felt like a lifeline. Henry could feel the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, just a little. He wasn't alone. These men, these strangers, had walked a path similar to his. They understood. Maybe not everything, but enough. The group began to move toward the front of the hotel, where buses had been arranged to transport everyone to the ceremony venue. Henry followed along, sticking to the edges of the group, keeping to himself as much as possible. The buses were large and comfortable, and once everyone had found a seat, the doors closed and the engine hummed to life. Henry sat by the window, staring out at the city as it passed by. His mind was still a whirlwind of emotions, but there was something comforting about the motion, the quiet hum of the engine, and the soft chatter of the other veterans. It was familiar in a way that he hadn't expected. The National Veterans Hall was a towering, majestic building, set in the heart of the city. As the bus pulled up to the front, Henry felt his heart rate spike again. This was it. This was the moment he had been dreading. He stepped off the bus, his boots clicking against the pavement, and followed the others inside. The hall was grand and imposing, its high ceilings and polished marble floors reflecting the light that streamed in from the windows. The walls were adorned with banners, flags, and photographs of veterans from all branches of the military, their faces frozen in time. There was a sense of reverence in the air, an almost palpable respect for the men and women who had served. Henry could feel it as he walked through the doors, a quiet, respectful energy that seemed to reverberate through every corner of the room. As he made his way to the registration table, he was handed a name tag and a program for the ceremony. The name tag was simple, just his name and the title Silver Star recipient. His stomach churned at the words, but he forced himself to pin it to his chest. He wasn't going to back out now. The hall began to fill with people, veterans, their families, dignitaries, and others. The chatter grew louder, more animated, and Henry found himself becoming increasingly uncomfortable. There was a sense of camaraderie here, a bond among the veterans, but he felt disconnected, like an outsider looking in. His eyes flitted around the room, searching for something familiar, someone who might make him feel less out of place. The ceremony itself began with a short speech from the event organizer, a tall, well-spoken man who talked about the importance of honoring those who had served. Henry could barely concentrate on the words. The room seemed to grow smaller with every passing minute, the weight of all the eyes on him pressing down on his chest. He could feel the sweat forming on the back of his neck. Why had he come here? Why was he allowing himself to be celebrated for something he hadn't earned? The questions circled in his mind, relentless. When it was finally time to take the stage, Henry felt like he was walking toward an execution, each step a reminder of how ill-suited he felt for this moment. He climbed the stairs to the podium, his legs shaky, and stood before the audience. The applause was warm but distant, and for a moment, he couldn't bring himself to meet anyone's gaze. But then, as he stood there, holding the silver star in his hand, something strange happened. He thought about his fallen comrades again, the men who had died that day, the ones who would never have the chance to stand in front of a crowd and be recognized. They deserved this more than he did. They deserved the applause, the recognition. They deserved to be remembered. Henry raised the medal above his head, trying to steady his shaking hands. The moment felt surreal, like he was standing outside of himself, watching everything unfold as if he were an observer, not a participant. But in that moment, something inside him began to shift. It wasn't a grand revelation. It wasn't some sudden epiphany. But there, in the quiet space of the ceremony, Henry began to understand something. This wasn't about him. This wasn't about the silver star or the recognition. This was about honoring the past, the sacrifices made, and the men who had given everything so that others might live. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The applause echoed through the hall, a steady rhythm of recognition, a cacophony that seemed both distant and deafening to Henry. Standing at the podium, Silver Star clutched tightly in his hand, he felt a wave of nausea rise up in him. It wasn't the kind of nausea that came from fear, nor from anything physical, but an overwhelming sense of disconnection. A cold, empty sensation, like something had been taken from him in the very moment he had received this symbol of honor. For a moment, he wondered if he had been wrong to come at all. The MC, a well-meaning but polished military officer with a bright smile and too much enthusiasm, continued to speak about the significance of the Silver Star and the courage required to earn it. The crowd around him was still clapping, but Henry felt like he was frozen in time, caught in the limbo between reality and some higher version of himself that he hadn't known existed. He could feel the weight of the medal, cold and heavy against his palm, as though it were a physical manifestation of everything he had ever tried to outrun: guilt, loss, the ghosts of comrades who never made it home. Henry Dodd, the MC, was saying, his voice rising above the applause, served with exceptional valor, embodying the highest ideals of courage and commitment. We are here today to honor him for his service to our country. The words hung in the air, and Henry's stomach turned. It felt wrong. The accolades, the recognition, it all felt out of place. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had just survived. As the applause began to die down, Henry was handed a microphone. It was part of the program, a chance for the award recipients to say a few words. The polite thing to do, of course, was to smile and thank the audience, to speak about the honor of being recognized, to perhaps even share some humble words about the experience. But as Henry stood there, the weight of the microphone in his hand felt like a symbol of everything he had avoided for years. The spotlight, the expectation, the burden of having to be something he wasn't sure he was anymore. His mind raced, the words in his head tumbling over each other, fighting for dominance. He had rehearsed nothing. There was nothing to rehearse. The reality of the situation had only just hit him. What was he supposed to say? What could he say? It wasn't as though he could simply thank the audience and leave. Nor could he fake sincerity in a moment as important as this. He could not give them a rehearsed, meaningless speech. And yet, there was something inside him that demanded he try to make sense of it, try to find some kind of answer in the words he was about to speak. A faint rustle of silence spread over the room. He could feel everyone watching, waiting. The tension in the air grew heavier, almost palpable. Henry's hands shook, his throat tightened, and for a brief moment, he thought he might break. His eyes drifted downward to the silver star in his hand. There it was, a symbol of valor, a symbol of courage, a symbol of survival. But none of those things felt true. At least, not to him. He took a deep breath, his gaze lifting back toward the audience. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy and unfamiliar. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, but I don't deserve this. I didn't earn it. Not by myself." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, foreign and jagged, cutting through the carefully constructed veneer of military formality. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a soft whisper of confusion, and Henry could almost feel their eyes on him, scrutinizing him. He wasn't sure if they understood, if they even cared. But in that moment, all he cared about was getting the truth out. He paused, feeling the silence stretch longer than it should have. I was lucky enough to make it out. But I didn't do it alone. There were others with me, men who didn't come home. Men who should be standing here, not me. This medal, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to them, to those who gave everything. I just survived. His words faltered, but somehow they felt like the only truth he could offer. The weight of the silver star in his palm felt unbearable now, as if it had taken on a life of its own. He had always been told that the medal represented the courage of those who fought alongside him, the valor of those who kept moving forward, even in the face of death. But now, standing on this stage, he couldn't shake the feeling that the silver star was a lie that erased the names of his fallen comrades, a lie that replaced them with his own face. The microphone dropped heavily from his hand, and Henry quickly turned away from the podium, his legs unsteady as he retreated back toward the side of the stage. He could feel the eyes of the crowd following him, some with confusion, some with judgment, but all of them watching him closely, perhaps waiting for him to explain, to justify his words. But Henry didn't have the answers. He didn't know how to explain that the award, this moment of recognition, had come too late for him to ever truly accept it. He found a seat at the back of the hall, away from the crowd, away from the ceremony. His hands shook, not from nervousness but from something deeper, something darker. The medal rested heavily in his pocket, but it didn't feel like an honor anymore. It felt like a shackle, a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had never truly faced. The rest of the ceremony went on without him. Speeches were made, awards were handed out, and stories of heroism and bravery were shared. The audience clapped and cheered, but Henry's mind was elsewhere, far away from the artificial celebrations taking place around him. All he could think about was the men who should have been here, the ones who would never walk across that stage, never hold their medals. By the time the ceremony was winding down, Henry felt emotionally drained. The excitement and gratitude he had expected to feel had never materialized. Instead, there was only an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The applause, the congratulations, the praise, it all felt hollow. It wasn't what he had imagined it would be. It wasn't the closure he had hoped for. Later that evening, after the final speeches and handshakes had been exchanged, the veterans and their families dispersed to various after-parties, gatherings, and dinners. Henry didn't join them. He couldn't. Instead, he found himself alone in his hotel room, staring at the silver star that now rested on the dresser. The cold metal caught the light from the lampshade, and for a moment, it almost gleamed with an unsettling intensity. Henry picked it up again, turning it slowly in his fingers. He hadn't earned it. He had survived. That was all. He hadn't been a hero, and in his heart, he knew it. The men who had fought alongside him, who had bled and died, were the real heroes. Not him. He thought about what the silver star represented: bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, the willingness to fight for something greater than oneself. But for Henry, it felt like a betrayal. He had never wanted the spotlight. He never wanted to be a hero. He just wanted to be left alone, to live in peace with the memories of those he had lost. Instead, here he was, holding this symbol of something he couldn't reconcile with the reality of what had happened. The truth, Henry realized, was that the Silver Star had not given him what he wanted. He had thought it might bring him closure, recognition for the sacrifices made, but all it had done was force him to confront his own inadequacies, his own failures. The medal hadn't healed the wounds inside him. It had only made them ache more. The applause hadn't silenced the ghosts. It had only made them louder. As he sat alone in his room, the Silver Star in his hand, Henry understood that the thing he had been searching for, closure, peace, recognition, was never going to come from an award. It wasn't something that could be given to him by others. It wasn't something that could be earned through survival. It was something he would have to find within himself. And in that moment, Henry knew that the real battle had only just begun. The silence in Henry's hotel room felt suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on his chest as if the very air had turned heavy with unspoken truths. The Silver Star sat on the small dresser across the room, its cold metal gleaming faintly in the dim light of the table lamp. Henry hadn't touched it since he'd placed it there earlier, and now, it seemed almost like a foreign object, a symbol of something he wasn't sure he wanted or deserved. The more he looked at it, the more he felt the creeping sense of guilt coil around his chest, tightening with each passing second. His thoughts raced as he sat on the edge of the bed, his hands still trembling. The evening had ended hours ago, the ceremony over, and he had slipped away from the reception without saying a word to anyone. The excitement, the cheerfulness of the other veterans and their families, it all seemed so far removed from him. They were celebrating, patting each other on the back, reliving their experiences through stories and jokes. But Henry felt like an outsider in a room full of familiar faces. The applause, the smiles, the admiration, they felt fake, hollow, as though they were being directed at a man who had been mistaken for a hero. And it ate at him. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the service of his comrades, or that he didn't believe in the value of what they had all done together. He just didn't think he deserved any recognition. Not for this. Not for surviving. The reality of it hit him harder now than ever before. What he had thought would be the culmination of his years of service had only deepened the chasm inside him. Recognition didn't heal the wounds. It just made them more visible. The guilt gnawed at him like an animal with claws, and the more he tried to push it down, the sharper the pain became. He stood up abruptly, pacing around the small hotel room. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't think clearly. He didn't know what he expected to find. What had he come here for? What was this ceremony really about? He had gone there looking for closure, perhaps even hoping that some part of the honor and recognition would provide a balm for the scars left on his soul. He had convinced himself that if he were awarded the Silver Star, some of the weight he carried would lift. Somehow, through the acknowledgement of his service, he would be able to finally put the past behind him. But that wasn't what happened. The Silver Star had not freed him. If anything, it had cemented the realization that he could never outrun his past. He thought that the applause, the standing ovation, the ceremonial weight of the moment would make it all right, that it would allow him to feel at peace with what had happened, peace with the men he had lost, peace with the things he had done. But it hadn't. Instead, all it had done was bring the reality crashing into him. The recognition, the medal, it was just a piece of metal. It didn't fill the emptiness that had been left in the wake of everything he had experienced. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the flood of memories that threatened to overwhelm him. The faces of his fallen comrades flashed before him, one after the other. They were the ones who should have been on that stage. They were the ones who deserved the applause, the praise. They had given everything for a cause they believed in. They had given their lives. And Henry? He had survived. But that survival, it seemed like a curse rather than a gift. The guilt of it was suffocating. In the days that followed, Henry tried to bury himself in distractions. He walked the streets of the city aimlessly, hoping that some physical exertion would clear his head, but it didn't. The city, with its bright lights and busy traffic, felt like a maze, and he felt more lost than ever. He couldn't shake the feeling of being an imposter, of being trapped in a role he had never asked for. The silver star still sat in his hotel room, untouched. He couldn't bring himself to get rid of it, but he also couldn't bring himself to look at it. He tried calling his family, but the conversation always seemed to end quickly, as if they too could feel the tension in his voice, the heaviness in his words. They were proud of him, of course. Proud of his service. Proud of the silver star. But none of them could understand what he was feeling. None of them had been there, in the field, shoulder to shoulder with the men who had died. None of them had lived through the hell that he had lived through. The distance between them was impossible to bridge, and so he found himself retreating further into himself, even as he stood surrounded by people who meant well. Late one night, after a long, restless evening of walking the streets, Henry sat alone in a small cafe, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold. The cafe was nearly empty, the late hour keeping the patrons away. A song played softly on the jukebox, a quiet, melancholy tune that seemed to match his mood perfectly. He didn't know why he had come here. Maybe it was the need to escape his hotel room, the suffocating silence of his thoughts. Maybe it was the feeling that he was unraveling, and he needed something, anything, to distract him from the inevitable confrontation he had to have with himself. As he sat there, staring out the window into the dark streets, his mind kept returning to that moment during the ceremony when he had stood at the podium. The applause had been deafening, but in the midst of it, he had felt a strange sensation, a sensation of being detached, of being separate from it all. The recognition, the words, the crowd, it all felt like a performance. But it wasn't his performance. The award hadn't come with the peace he had hoped for. It hadn't come with a sense of achievement, either. It had come with the crushing weight of the truth that he had never truly accepted. He had been marked by something far more significant than any medal could ever convey. Henry's gaze dropped to his hands, the same hands that had held rifles, maps, and a multitude of responsibilities. But it wasn't the weight of those things that haunted him now. It was the weight of survival. The men who had fallen in battle, they were heroes. They had lived and died by the same code he had. They had given everything for their brothers in arms. And he had made it out alive, but at what cost? What did it mean to survive when others couldn't? His fingers tightened around the mug in front of him, and a quiet sob caught in his throat. He wanted to let it out, to release the wave of emotions that threatened to drown him, but the tears never came. Instead, a dry ache filled his chest, a hollow ache that had been there for so long he couldn't remember a time without it. It was the ache of regret, the ache of knowing that he would never feel the closure he had once imagined. He had thought that this silver star would give him that closure. He had believed that recognition, the appreciation of others, would somehow fill the emptiness inside him. But now, he understood the truth. It wasn't recognition he needed. It wasn't an award or an applause. It was peace. And peace wasn't something that could be handed to him. Peace was something he would have to find on his own, and it would come only after he learned to forgive himself. That night, he returned to his hotel room, but the silver star remained where it had been placed earlier, unmoved, untouched. For a long time, Henry stood in front of the dresser, staring at it. He thought about the men who had been with him, the men who had died beside him, and the unspoken promise he had made to them that he would never forget. But that promise, he realized, had never been about receiving a medal. It had been about living with the truth, with the pain, and finding a way to honor them through his actions, through the choices he made. For the first time in years, Henry understood that the price of his survival had never been about the cost of his life. It was the cost of living with it. The silver star would never give him the peace he sought. But maybe, just maybe, he could find that peace by learning to live with the weight of it, by learning to forgive himself. He wasn't sure how to begin, but he knew that the first step was facing the truth. Not just about the medal or the ceremony, but about himself. Only then could he begin to heal. When Henry returned to the small town that he had once called home, the weight of his journey seemed to follow him like a shadow. The streets were just as he remembered them, quiet, with familiar houses and storefronts that had hardly changed in the years since he left. The trees lining the sidewalks were already beginning to turn yellow and orange with the coming of fall. In many ways, the town felt like a time capsule, preserving the past in amber, untouched by the passage of time. And yet, Henry knew, with a painful clarity, that he was no longer the same person who had left. It was strange to think that only a few weeks had passed since he had stood on that stage, holding the silver star, feeling like a stranger to himself. He had hoped that the ceremony would bring some kind of closure, some sense of peace, but instead, it had forced him to confront the truth about what he truly needed, and that, he realized, had nothing to do with the recognition he thought he wanted. That truth had been harder to face than any battlefield he'd ever been on, but it was the only way forward. As Henry drove down the familiar streets, past the old diner and the faded gas station, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He had been away for so long, and coming back now felt like stepping into someone else's life. His father's house, the one he had grown up in, was still there, nestled at the edge of the town. The same creaky porch steps, the same red door. Nothing had changed. Yet everything had. He parked his truck in the driveway, but he didn't immediately get out. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the house. The years had passed quickly, but for some reason, coming home now felt like a confrontation. He hadn't come back for the usual reasons, family gatherings, holidays, or birthdays. No, this time, he was back because of something he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the need to prove something to himself, or maybe it was the need to return to some semblance of normalcy, to make sense of all that had happened. But there was something else, a quiet, persistent ache in his chest, a reminder of the weight of what he had seen, of the men he had lost, of the truths he had faced in the quiet solitude of his own mind. He finally opened the door and stepped out of the truck, the cool air brushing against his face. As he walked up to the porch, his mind replayed fragments of conversations he had had with his parents before he left for the war. It had been years, but they were still alive, still in this house, still waiting for him. He wondered what they would say. What could he possibly tell them after everything that had happened? The door creaked open, and his mother appeared, her face lighting up with a mixture of surprise and joy. She had always been the steady, loving force in his life, the one who kept everything together when everything else seemed to fall apart. But even now, after all the years, there was something different about the way she looked at him. It was as though she could sense that something had shifted in him, something she couldn't quite name, but that she knew was there. "Henry," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly as she took a step forward. "I didn't expect you so soon. Come inside. Your father's out back, but we can wait for him." He nodded, offering a small smile, though it felt foreign on his face. "Thanks, Mom." They embraced briefly, the way they always did, but this time, the hug lingered just a little longer, and Henry felt a strange tightness in his chest. He pulled back and looked at her, really looked at her, her tired eyes, her silvering hair. He hadn't realized how much he had missed her until that very moment. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "It's been a lot. The ceremony, the award, everything." Henry hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, to share the weight of the things he had carried inside for so long, but he wasn't sure where to begin. What words could he use to explain it all? How could he possibly convey the disillusionment, the confusion, the guilt that had plagued him since he had returned from the war? "I'm okay," he said, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "I'm just still processing everything." She nodded, as if accepting the answer, though he could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. They sat down together in the kitchen, and as Henry tried to settle into the familiar rhythms of the house, he couldn't help but feel like an intruder. The conversations they had once had about his future, about his plans after returning from the war, felt like they belonged to someone else. The version of himself who had once dreamed of coming back and fitting in again seemed like a distant memory, like a ghost that was now unreachable. Instead, he was left with the raw truth. He was living with a version of himself that was unrecognizable. Later that evening, after a quiet dinner with his parents, Henry walked outside and sat on the porch steps, looking out into the yard. The familiar sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filled the air, but they only reminded him of how much had changed. The home he had once found comfort in now seemed like a prison, a place that held his past but not the man he had become. He leaned back, staring up at the stars. They were the same stars he had seen countless nights in the desert, but they felt different now. They felt like a reminder of everything he had lost, his youth, his innocence, the men he had fought beside. He could almost hear their voices on the wind, calling to him. Henry closed his eyes, feeling the weight of their absence. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anymore?" he asked softly, more to himself than to anyone in particular. The question was a quiet one, but it carried the weight of everything he had been through. The answer came from his mother's voice, soft but steady, as she stepped out onto the porch and sat beside him. "Sometimes," she said, "but that's when you have to remember where you came from. You may have changed, Henry, but this place, this family, will always be here for you, no matter what." Her words, simple and unwavering, cut through the fog of his confusion. Maybe it was true. Maybe the place didn't matter so much. Maybe it wasn't about fitting into some idealized version of his past, but about accepting the man he had become. He had been looking for peace in the wrong places, through the silver star, through recognition, through external validation. But peace didn't come from medals. It came from the quiet moments, the moments of understanding and connection, even if those moments weren't always perfect. Henry didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever fully reconcile the man he was with the man he had been. But for the first time, he felt like he could live with the questions, live with the uncertainty, and still find a way forward. He didn't need answers to every question. He didn't need to find closure for everything. What mattered was that he could live with himself, live with the choices he had made, the people he had lost, and the man he had become. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a grand revelation or an instant fix, but it was enough. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would never be easy. But as he sat beside his mother, watching the stars, Henry knew that he could face whatever came next, because he had finally accepted the truth that had been staring him in the face all along. He had survived. And that in itself was enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.